Fragments of silicon. In a pinch, they can be formed into a protective barrier.
All right, welcome to another installment of Fragments of Silicon. I'm your host, Adam. Joining me as always are Petty and Gollix. Let us get to the news. Gollix, why don't you start us off this week? Gollix?
Oh, I muted myself. Sorry. Well, we have a sickness in the family. My mother has a bad cold or virus or something. She's been tested. It's bad enough that she went to the doctor to check, but she's been tested and it's not flu or COVID. She's actually feeling better today than she was. But she was pretty down and out for a couple of days with, and had a bit of laryngitis, so like she could barely talk yesterday, so hopefully that's better. But I'm also hoping Dad hasn't gotten it yet, but who knows, and hopefully I don't. We think she probably picked up something at the Christmas fair at church because she was working there this past weekend. Otherwise, I don't really think there's a whole lot going on. Couple of new video games have come out. I haven't gotten a chance to play it yet, but I got a copy of Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince. And the new Pokemon DLC comes out next week, and we're getting some news about that tomorrow morning or later this week. I don't know, one of those days.
And the
I think it's tomorrow morning.
Thing, is that a remake of the first one, or is that a new entry?
It is a new one.
Okay.
In most of them, well, I don't know about what the deal was with the Joker series. In the first one, you were playing as Terry, who is from Dragon Quest, I think, 6 or something. But he's an NPC. He's an NPC in that game. In this one, you are playing as Psaro from, I want to say, 4. He's a pretty significant character.
Insert joke about I'll talk to Ogre about the significance of those characters later.
Mm-hmm. And also, there just hasn't been one since the Joker games, which were on the 3DS, I think. It's been a while. But you know how I am about monster collecting games.
Indeed.
Oh, and I've had it for a while because I kickstarted it, but I started playing a bit of 9 Years of Shadows to see how good it was to decide about backing the studio that made its next project, and it's certainly very pretty. I've heard that it's a little bit basic in terms of some of the exploration features, but I'm also pretty easy to sell on Metroidvanias.
We've noticed.
Anyway, that's about most of what's happened.
All right. Well, Petty, it's your go.
So if anybody's wondering why my voice sounds weird, like mentioned last week, when my sister came back from Thanksgiving after seeing my niece, she brought home the plague. Not like COVID or anything like that, just like a general, like a upper respiratory illness type thing. And I got it. So I've been sick for the almost a week.
That's no fun.
Yeah.
Maybe you have the same thing my mom has.
Possibly. Who knows? But yeah, if you were wondering why I was silent during the reviews, if anyone follows those, that's why. Um, as far as personal news, my dad's car broke down. He had a 2015 Mitsubishi Mirage, and after 220,000 miles, the transmission decided it didn't want to live anymore. So he now has a pre-owned um 2022 Mirage. So hooray for upgrades. It has Android Auto in it, which is cool that we don't need to get him a GPS for Christmas. So I'm probably just gonna get him like a car phone mount or something like that. Because he has a terrible thing where he wants to just put his phone in between the seats when it's charging.
Yeah,
And in
that's
this,
a good way to lose your phone.
well, no, it gets worse. In this car, that's where the side airbags are. So if the
Ah,
airbag deploys, best case it knocks his phone down. Worst case, it could do significant enough damage to possibly cause a leak or
yeah.
fire,
Propel phone into you at high velocity.
or just break the phone that it would cause the battery to short and cause a fire. You know,
Yeah,
last thing you need is to be trapped in a vehicle with a burning phone.
right.
So yeah, he's probably gonna tell me, "Oh, I don't need it," but I'd rather him have that than the
I should
potential
probably get
car
something
fire.
like that too.
Yeah, like I think part of the problem is his phone or his car wasn't designed for somebody to just have a phone in there. Like my mom's car has a like kind of console box that you could put a phone in if it needs to charge because there's a USB port in there.
Mm-hmm.
But my dad's USB port for using his Android Auto is at the front of the console, and there's nowhere to put the phone. So kind of design failure, but we have ways to deal with it. So that's been fun. I also on my PS5 got the game Control from Remedy, if any of y'all remember that. And so far it's been fun, but good lord, Remedy still needs to learn what the hell a difficulty curve is and not difficulty jackknife. So yeah, that's been a trip. And um I think that's it for me. So next victim.
All right. So my news for the week. Let's see. Um, family drama is still going on, and it keeps shifting the plans for the holiday. Latest there is my brother and his children will be coming in on Christmas Eve day. So, December 24th.
Fun. Good thing
Um,
we're going to be off.
yeah. Well, they were originally supposed to do that New Year's Day, but uh, things happened, um, and plans keep shifting. And let's just say that particular endeavor is also a bit shaky. Uh, Once again, like these are the lesser aftershocks of a divorce proceeding.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, which has been further complicated by stuff that I will not get into here. Like, let's see. Had to delay a trip to the doctor's office due to circumstances surrounding the vehicle. It's it's dealing with some headlight issues. That's a whole sort of affair there. Like, once again, don't want to get too deep in the weeds there in terms of gaming. Decided to play through the original Fallout after watching a couple of H Bomber Guy videos on Fallout. And next thing I knew, 4 hours had passed.
Sounds about like playing Fallout, yeah.
Well, it's also one of the good Fallouts.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's about my news for the week. So, merrily, we shall roll along to the interview portion of the broadcast. And joining us this week is Matt Hughson.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
No problem. No problem. So, right. How we like to get started is we like to get to know the people behind the games and all that. And we begin by asking this particular question: what got you interested in video games, both on a personal and a professional level?
I think I've just always been into games. I was born in 82, so kind of my formative years were around the NES, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, stuff like that. So I was always into games. I went to university for game development and basically around like the 2000, and then I've basically worked in games ever since.
Were there any particular titles in your youth that you were drawn to?
Yeah, probably the obvious ones, Mario Brothers games. I was a big Nintendo fan. And then in high school, GoldenEye was massive, playing that every night. So those were really huge for me as a kid. StarCraft a bit later, I got really into. And then, yeah, I don't think any one in particular, though, really got me into development per se. I didn't really realize that you could make games professionally as a kid, which seems strange because obviously people are making the games, but I didn't really clue into it until much later. So I wasn't really thinking about being inspired by a game to kind of go down a career path. I was just playing games for fun. And yeah, I was a huge Nintendo fan for many, many years, basically survived as a Nintendo fanboy until the Wii, I think, is where that ended, and kind of switched over to Xbox.
So you mentioned that you went to college specifically to develop games. And I got to ask, what was the spark behind that particular choice?
I guess if I remember correctly, I just saw an ad in a gaming magazine or something like that, and was like, "Oh my god, I can actually learn to make games." I had no idea how to make games. I'd never programmed or anything like that. So the university I went to had like a very focused on game development course, which was quite unique at the time. It's very common now, but at the time, it was one of basically two schools in North America that had that kind of thing. So it was really appealing, the idea of just going off to this school, and when I graduate, I would know how to make games. I would go from knowing nothing to knowing exactly how to make a game. So that was pretty exciting and appealing to me as somebody who didn't really know what I was doing. And I thought the school was actually like a game design school. I thought I was going to learn level design and stuff like that, but it turned out to be like a really hardcore programming course. But that turned out to be a really good thing for me. I really like programming and fell in love with it while I was there. But yeah, at the time, I thought I was kind of going to be a more like paper designer.
I mean, it makes sense given the time frame. Like, we're talking what, the early to mid 2000s, like about 20 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking pre-Unity and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. There wasn't the proliferation of kind of game engines where you could imagine just going and learning level design, and I think even teams at the time were much smaller, right? So you wouldn't have maybe you'd probably have dedicated level designers, but maybe not to the level they do now, where you could, dedicate an entire career to that. So,
Right.
yeah, you're right. That totally makes sense. Thinking back.
Yeah. Anyway, so where did you end up after graduation?
I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I went to school in Florida, and then after I graduated, I came back to Toronto. But at the time, in the early 2000s, there was almost no game companies in Toronto. So I really, really struggled to find my first job. I ended up finding this small startup studio, kind of begged for a spot, and eventually just said, I'll just come, let me do anything, I'll work for free. So I worked at this small startup for free, eventually kind of earned myself a paycheck, and then shortly after, that company went out of business and I was looking for work again. And then, I don't know why it didn't occur to me, but I was pretty young and had no ties to Toronto, so I could have been looking all over the world for work, but I wasn't. And I kind of stumbled across a job in Victoria, British Columbia, which is on the west coast of Canada, and landed a job there, actually teaching. And from there, I got a job at Electronic Arts, which is in Vancouver, Canada, just a few hours away from Victoria. And that kind of started my game career proper at that point.
And how long were you at EA?
I think I was there about a year and a half, 2 years. Yeah, about that.
Okay. And what did you work on there?
I was part of what we call the Central Online Group. So this was PS2, Xbox original era, where there wasn't much infrastructure for online. Xbox was pretty good, but PlayStation basically had nothing. So things like friends, text chat, voice chat, none of it was provided by the console. So at EA, we basically built a shared library. It was more than a library, it was an entire executable, basically a shared kind of set of functionality that all the EA Sports games used. So I only worked there for a year and a half, but I'm credited on a couple dozen games, I think, because basically every online sports game and even some non-sports games use this one library that we built. So we were doing things like building tournaments, leaderboards, text chat, all that kind of stuff. And if you go back and look at the 2006, 2007 era EA games, you'll see every time you go online, it essentially launches a separate executable, and they all kind of look more or less the same. They change the background, maybe change the colors and stuff like that, but that's what I was working on.
And where did you end up after EA?
I left EA to go to a company called Radical Entertainment, where we were working on a whole bunch of stuff. When I started, I think the studio was 400 people or something like that. And we had 4 or 5 projects active. They had just released Scarface, I think, and Simpsons Hit and Run. And I started there in a similar role as I was doing at EA, working on the Central Online team for all of their titles. And the main project I was focused on was a game called Prototype, which was kind of an open world, over the top kind of, anti-hero kind of game. So I spent a lot of time on that. And then essentially while I was there, the company got bought by Activision. And we went from a studio of 400 working on 4 games, essentially chopped the studio in half down to 2 games, half the amount of people, and then chopped us in half again until all we were making was Prototype. And then that eventually we shipped Prototype 1 and 2. And then we were working on the next project, and that got canceled. And by the time I left, I think we were down to maybe 10 people in the studio. So it was pretty, pretty sad, to be honest. It was a pretty big studio in Vancouver. It was probably the second biggest next to EA. So it was quite a history. It had been around for over 25 years, I think, at the time. They have games all the way back to like the NES and Game Boy and stuff. So yeah, it was pretty brutal to see that get essentially decimated. And then I left. I left basically when we were just kind of a couple people left at the studio.
I don't think Radical Entertainment exists anymore.
Yeah, I think they've essentially changed the name to something like Activision Central Technology, something like that. But yeah, we were like when I left, we were essentially just helping other studios. I was working on Destiny at the time, so like at Bungie. So we were basically just farmed out to different studios that needed help, kind of getting their games across the finish line.
I suppose if it's any consolation, like if Radical had persisted, it probably would have ended up on Call of Duty like everything else.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I understand. I totally get like where Activision's coming from. At the time, Call of Duty it still is, I guess, but it was absolutely massive. And we're making this game that's barely making a profit. And like, well, why would we put money into that when we could put that into cash cow? So I get it, but
it's still disheartening.
Yeah.
So, where does the story continue from there?
Yeah, so from there, after that, basically my the technical director that I worked under after that, he left to go start a new studio with a Polish game company called Techland, who had done I forget. We worked on Dying Light, but the game before that, Dead Island. Sorry, name was escaping me. Yeah. So he was Polish, and he knew some guys in Poland who worked at Techland, and they wanted to start up a studio in Vancouver to kind of feed off some. Like we have a lot of game studios here, so they wanted to feed off some of the talent here. So he was basically set off with the agenda of starting a branch of Techland in Vancouver. So I went with him to start that company. We worked on Dying Light a whole bunch. I stayed there for about a year before leaving, and now they're actually got bought out by CD Projekt Red. So they're CD Projekt Red Vancouver now, I think. But yeah, I left there to go to Microsoft, Microsoft, the Coalition specifically, which is where I am today. So I left there to go work on Gears of War. So I've basically worked on every Gears of War that they've done since around like 2014, 15. I think I've been there about 10 years, I guess. Actually, yeah, 10 years this November. I just got my thing. So 2013, I guess I went there.
Okay. Right. So that brings us to the present and the recent past, and kind of to full circle everything, because we have you here in your capacity as a homebrew developer.
Right.
So what made you want to make old NES, Game Boy, what have you, games?
Yeah, so I guess like during that whole era I just described, that was kind of my day job, work history. But on the side, I was always working on smaller personal projects that always had a tilt towards retro games, for the most part, retro games. So 2D pixel art, that kind of thing. And essentially I would try to get them more and more authentic looking. And as time went by, it basically reached the point where I was more or less making kind of an NES game, but not on the NES. So I was making sure like pixels were all correct, and I was limiting color palettes. I was working a lot on Pico 8. I'm not sure if you've seen that before, but it's essentially a fantasy console similar to the NES. But yeah, so it got to the point where I kind of knew I really liked working in that kind of limited, restricted environment. And yeah, as to why like I kind of made that leap or what interested me, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up with the NES, so I was a huge fan. I collected a lot in the late 90s, had a few hundred NES games, collected N64, Super Nintendo, all that stuff. So I was pretty into the NES scene. I ran an emulation site in the late 90s, stuff like that. So I was pretty into that world, but I had kind of got out of it, I would say, like over like the 2010 and beyond, as kind of my adult life started to take shape. I kind of lost track of that stuff a bit, and I basically missed the whole homebrew scene evolving, because when I was last into it, it was basically like people were just barely getting something to show up on screen. Like it was an achievement just to have, say, tic tac toe or Minesweeper or something like that. So it was interesting from a technical level, but it wasn't really interesting a gameplay level. But then, yeah, fast forward to around, I guess, 2018, 2019. I can't remember which game came first. Sorry, what was that? Oh, sorry. I thought you said something there.
No, I think it was a momentary blip of echo.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so basically around 2018, I can't remember which game came out first, but two games came out that were pretty inspirational for me. One was called Micromages, which was an NES homebrew game. It went pretty viral. It did insane numbers on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and that kind of, as a fan of the NES, kind of caught my attention. And another game, which was called Nescape, was another homebrew that wasn't quite as like huge, but what was kind of interesting about that one is the guy who made it also ran a podcast called The Assembly Line, which is a behind the scenes look at how NES homebrew games are made. So by picking up that Nescape game, Micromages, I was introduced to this podcast and started to learn what it goes into actually making an NES game, which I had always assumed was kind of for the most elite programmers on the planet. But as I listened to that, I realized Kevin, who made Nescape and did that podcast, he had never programmed prior to making an NES game, or had done like maybe web programming or something like that. Pretty, like, it was a pretty big stretch for him, I think. So kind of opened my eyes to realize, like, hey, I've been making games for like 20 years now. I have the skill set. I can actually achieve kind of a lifelong dream of mine to make an NES game, and that's how it came to begin. So around like 2020, I started working on my first game.
Like, yeah, I think we had Kevin on the program last year. Talked about NES.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
Kevin Hanley.
Yeah. In fact, we've had a few like NES retro game developers and Game Boy game developers on the program. It's always fascinating because the thing that constantly comes up with these systems are the limitation
Yes.
of everything. And
yeah. So I was just going to say, like, on the limitation side, like something that's really fun and appealing to me as a developer is I spend all day working on these massive kind of AAA games that are like, they're not fragile, but like a small change can have a massive impact. It's really hard to know like what your small change is, how that's going to ripple across the whole game. And like so many people, 400 plus people working on the project. It's really hard to kind of wrap your head around the whole thing. But when you're working on a homebrew game, you can essentially keep the entire project mentally mapped in your head all at once. Like I can think of like Witch and Whiz on screen here. I can picture exactly how that entire code base works still to this day. And that's like something you don't get on a bigger project. So it's quite appealing to me as a developer to have something smaller with limits, and it's limits in a way that everybody's kind of playing by the same rules. So you can do that kind of thing in say Unity or Unreal Engine, but you're up against like the people making Halo and Gears of War or whatever. So on the NES, everybody's got the same playing field, and you can kind of compete one-on-one in a way that you can't maybe on Steam and stuff like that.
not easily. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, people pull it off, but it's hard. It's kind of unicorn. You got to be one in a million to make that work.
it's also we've encountered more than a few games that have local play only, which is just by design kind of harder to do on a computer than on a console. Yeah.
Local multiplayer, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Like it's probably not much harder, but it's more like strange, right? It's not very common to have two people sitting at a PC.
Yeah, the concept of a like PC in your entertainment system isn't really needed much anymore with, smart TVs and game consoles having all the streaming and media platforms they do now. You don't really need one there.
Yeah.
You don't need a PC there anymore.
Yeah, I have a home theater PC that probably 10 years ago I was so excited about, and I could access everything, and now I haven't turned it on probably in 5 years because it's so unnecessary now.
Yeah, because insert game console or smart TV can do everything it can. It
Yeah.
just doesn't run Windows, so you can't play games locally, but
Yeah. Now, to make sure about things, you do develop for real hardware, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Everything I make is, well, I guess I've done two consoles so far. I make games for the NES and Game Boy. And yeah, both of those are targeting like physical hardware. They both have physical cartridge releases and all that stuff. And of course, emulators run them as well. But yeah, everything I do is for the hardware.
Yeah. And that is an important distinction to make because, there are those who, do the retro style, but, they make their game in, Unity or a game maker, what have you.
or they fudge it just
Yeah.
enough that it wouldn't work on actual hardware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always like an interesting discussion of like taking a game like say Shovel Knight or something like that looks pretty close, and like what would it take to actually bring it to the consoles they're trying to mimic. But yeah, I think they're all like great. Like essentially what you're describing is what I was doing prior to working on NES hardware, which I think is cool too. It's got its own advantages as well. You can kind of push the limits here and there, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm like, it all depends on what you're aiming for, I think. And also, if you want to be authentically constrained or not, because that is a thing with a lot of the faux retro games. They want to have the look of an 8-bit game, but then not necessarily want to have all the problems that beset an 8-bit, a game on the NES. Like,
yeah,
like I know there are people who want and they demand sprite flicker in their retro throwbacks, but I'm like,
We wonder
I
what
personally,
drugs these people are on.
yeah, I'm like I get it on an intellectual level in the sense that, yeah, that was a part of the NES, but that was the thing I always hated about that system, and I didn't miss it when it was gone.
Well, like as somebody
So,
who knows people who are photosensitive, I can't play games with screen flicker around them because it could trigger a seizure.
right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
all
there's
fun and games
and
till
there
your homie's flopping around like a fish.
yeah, definitely things people weren't thinking about back then. Yeah, and it's interesting too. Like, I think there's the obvious things you mentioned, like sprite flicker, limited the number of sprites, colors, and stuff like that. But I find one of the things that gets to me working on the actual hardware is how much time you have to spend on the things you don't see, like optimization, like CPU optimization, memory optimization, compression, all these things that even if you had a game that looked completely accurate to the NES, if you're making it for PC, you would skip all of that because you have unlimited memory, essentially unlimited CPU for a game like this. So that part's a little frustrating. And like the NES itself doesn't have any debug memory compared to like a modern dev kit kind of thing. So as you're making the game, if you want to just throw in something to test it real quick, you have to make space for it. So if your cartridge is essentially full, you have to delete stuff to kind of fit in the new thing to test it out. It's quite you spend a lot of time doing things that people would have no idea you're actually doing that. But that's part of the fun. It's more of a puzzle than anything. It's kind of or a craft. I don't know. It reminds me of like woodworking or something like that. It's not really necessary. I can go to IKEA and buy probably a better bed than I can make, but there's some joy in kind of puzzling that out yourself.
Now, are these targeted to be like put on like official NES carts, or is it best used like a flash cart who can like cheat with memory a little bit?
Do you mean during development or like after release?
After release and development, either one.
Yeah, in development, I would say I do 99% of my development in emulators because you get all the debug tools. You can, save states, all that stuff that is, well, it's a lot of that stuff is helpful when you're a
The
player,
stuff
but
you
it's
would have
also
had to
super
pay
helpful.
Nintendo a lot for special hardware for.
Well, as far as I know, there was no special hardware. So, like, when you go back and look at devs from that era, they were basically kit bashing together their own dev kits with like ribbon cables coming out of their PC connected to like a hodgepodge of cartridge wires and stuff like that to get stuff on the cartridge quickly because they had to burn ROMs essentially to test their games. They had, I assume, no emulators or anything like that. So, yeah, for me, I do almost everything in an emulator, and then I have a EverDrive Pro, which has a USB connection to my PC. So once in a while, I'll deploy to my to that cartridge and test it out on my CRT and stuff. But I'm mostly just looking.
Sanity check type thing, make sure
Yeah,
because I know
yeah,
sometimes
exactly.
emulators aren't totally console accurate.
Yeah, exactly. Although nowadays there's an emulator called Messen, which is like insanely accurate. So I think even that is kind of gone a little bit by the wayside. I mostly just use it to double check that the colors look okay because colors are something that aren't emulated
Yeah.
or are difficult to kind of have a consensus on what they should actually look like. So I like to look at it on my CRT and make sure it looks okay and double check clipping and stuff like that. But
Because I know connecting
yeah, generally it's
PC to a CRT is laborious.
yeah, it's pretty cool. Well, I don't. Yeah, I just connect my Nintendo to the CRT, and then I have a USB to my cartridge. But yeah, it's cool. It's I mostly just do it for fun, to be honest. To just load it up and see it. It runs so smooth. Like seeing an NES game running in an emulator versus running on real hardware on a CRT. It's so silky smooth on real hardware compared to even best emulators. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but yeah, it just looks awesome.
And I suppose we should ask about how you managed to do the cartridge production, because
right,
that's not necessarily an easy thing to do in the year of 2023. Not impossible, but it can be laborious.
Wink, wink.
What's that? Sorry.
Yeah, it's more.
Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Well, we've had people who do this, and they've told us how labor intensive it can all be.
Yeah, so I don't do it. That's my secret. There's a couple options if you don't want to. So like to do it yourself, yeah, you're actually buying PCBs, chips, ROM chips. You connect the ROM to your PC, download the code, solder it to a board, put it in your NES, test it, make sure it all works. But for me, I hire other people to do it. And there's a couple options. You can go through like something like AliExpress, and there's companies in China that'll do it for pretty cheap, but they're generally thought of as poor quality cartridges. I don't know the exact problems, but there's some voltage differences in how they build the cartridges that people say over time could damage your NES. So most of the kind of serious homebrew people don't go that route, and they do something like what I do, which is I use Broke Studios, which is a developer, but they're mostly a publisher nowadays. So if you go to Broke Studio website, you'll find homebrew cartridges for NES, Genesis, Game Boy. They do pretty much everything. So they're really popular. And then for Witch and Whiz, I went through Limited Run Games, which is kind of mostly publishing like Switch and PS4 and 5 stuff, but they do retro stuff once in a while, and they go through a company called Retrobit, which does all sorts of stuff like peripherals and things like that, but they also have a really good quality for their cartridges as well. So yeah, I hire other people to do it because it's super. Like the first game I released, I didn't even do the cartridges, but I did the like boxes, like sourced the boxes and the manuals and stuff like that. And even just that process was extremely time consuming. And the shipping part of it, that's probably the worst, is just shipping out hundreds of games. It's so time consuming, not really worth it to me. So yeah, I like to use Broke Studio a lot because they kind of, I just send them a list of every game I sold, who it's going to, and they make it happen, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I want to shift attention to From Below specifically, because this is an interesting release from you, and something I want to ask in regards to it off the bat is it's a puzzle game that's been released for apparently 3 systems. Like I see Nintendo Entertainment System, Game Boy, and the Nintendo Versus system. I'm like,
yeah,
like, so how does that work? Like, how does a Nintendo Versus system work?
Yeah, so that was the From Below was the first game I created, the first homebrew game I created. So that was for the NES. And essentially the latest game I'm writing is not quite true in this case, but every game I'd written up to recently, it was written in C, which, if you're not aware, is like a more modern language that is portable. So same code can be compiled for different platforms like Linux, Mac, Windows, that kind of thing. But it also can be compiled for NES, Game Boy, and so on. So a lot of the core logic for the game is identical for all 3 versions. So all of the gameplay logic is 1-to-1. The part that needs to get rewritten for each system is things like rendering sprites, loading level data, the format of the sprites and stuff like that, as well as like obviously going from a TV screen to a Game Boy screen. It's about a quarter of the size, so I have to make a bunch of concessions there. And then the Game Boy version, I added multiplayer between 2 Game Boys, so that's unique to that version as well. So that's kind of how I'm able to do all 3, because they all basically share the same code base, and I just fix up the connective tissue between the game and the console. The Nintendo Versus Arcade is interesting. Have you heard of that before? Or had you seen that? I hadn't.
I have played Nintendo Versus. Like there was a Chuck E. Cheese that had some of those. Like that's where I played the first Goonies game, for example. That they actually had that on arcade.
Okay,
it's
cool.
not the Goonies 2, it's the Goonies. It's a whole thing.
Okay, yeah, cool. That's like the Japanese game?
Yep.
Oh, cool.
Only came over here via the Nintendo Versus system.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that. Yeah, so when I kind of got into that side of things, I'd always thought the Nintendo Versus Arcade was the Play Choice Arcade, which for people listening, like that was essentially an NES sitting inside an arcade cabinet, and they could connect 10 cartridges and you could kind of pick one. So you were basically playing the home game in an arcade. But the Versus Arcade was a little different. It was still kind of an NES in the arcade cabinet, but it was original games made for that arcade hardware. And it was a slightly different, that you couldn't just put a cartridge in it. You had to actually write some code to make it all work. So That was all news to me. But yeah, essentially somebody on Twitter reached out and said, "Hey, I took your NES ROM and kind of hacked it a little to run on my Versus Arcade cabinet, and it basically works. It's just like the colors look all messed up, and it's not. There's a couple issues here and there, but it's like 90% there." That kind of sparked my interest in what is this thing? What would it take to get from where it is today to like a shippable game? So that kind of started really simple and ballooned as usual. But yeah, initially I just wanted to get the colors fixed because they have different video hardware on the Versus Arcade systems versus the home system. So all the colors are messed up. So after I fixed that, the same guy who kind of reached out and said, "Hey, check this out." He was telling me like how there's been no games made for the Versus Arcade system in 30 years. There's no homebrew, there's nothing. So I kind of got excited to be the first game to come out on the hardware in 30 years and started talking to that community about what they would want. And it was clear that it wouldn't be enough to just put the NES game on there. So I added things like attract mode, leaderboards, simplified the UI so that like there wasn't text options and stuff like that you might find on a home console game, but big like Fisher Price buttons, easy, medium, hard, stuff like that. I also added obviously like coin registering. So if you have it in an actual arcade cabinet, you have to put in coins, stuff like that. So by the end, yeah, it's basically still the same core gameplay, but it's been completely revamped as an actual arcade game. So you wouldn't think that it's a home console game.
The game itself deals with the coin registration for that. I figured that'd be a hardware level thing.
That's what I thought too. Yeah, I couldn't believe it. No, it's you have to do it in software. So there's nothing. Yeah, like there is a piece of hardware obviously that you check when a coin goes in, but you basically have to be listening for that event, that hardware event to happen 24/7. And if you miss it, their coin is lost. It's pretty wild, actually. Yeah, it really surprised me.
Right. The things you learn.
Yeah, that was a really fun project, though. It was pretty cool to think about, like, what would this actually be like? Because there are people who still have home arcades. I guess there's probably real arcades, but there's an enthusiast crowd who's really into arcades, and the Nintendo Versus Arcade has a pretty dedicated community that's definitely underserved. So I think they were pretty excited to have something new to play, even if it's more or less kind of a Tetris clone. I think it seemed to get a really good reception from them.
I mean, it's more than they got back in the day, because Tetris, Tetris, like Nintendo Tetris never came out in the arcades. There is an arcade Tetris, but that was put out by Atari Games.
Right.
Like,
there you go.
So, and another question I have in regards to From Below is this is a title that is on the NES and Game Boy. So I'm wondering, what's it like programming for those two systems in comparison to one another?
They're similar in a lot of ways. Like, they're obviously made by the same company, and I think the Game Boy was essentially an evolution of a lot of the stuff they probably learned on the NES, especially the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color almost feels like a souped up NES. It's kind of does a lot of what the NES does, but it's got more palettes. The color density is higher. It's got a whole bunch of pluses above the above the NES. So it was super fun to work on. I also found it really interesting to work on a system where there's so many variations of it. There's the Game Boy DMG, the Color, the Super Game Boy 2, the Pocket. There's all these different things that you can kind of like tap into if you choose to. And then on top of that, as I mentioned, I did the link cable multiplayer support. So that's a whole nother kind of ecosystem to dig into. So there was so much fertile ground there for somebody who had never done it before to explore. And I really wanted the game to take advantage of a lot of that stuff in a way that many games of the era didn't. So a single cartridge works on the black and white Game Boy, the color Game Boy, Super Game Boy. It's got Super Game Boy Border, Super Game Boy Colors, like all pretty much everything you could think of. It's all on a single cartridge. So that was a pretty interesting problem for me to kind of tackle and a goal to set for myself.
Especially if they're using the original cartridge parameters.
Oh, what was that? Sorry, say that again.
Especially if they're using the original cartridge parameters.
Yeah, it's all it all uses original hardware, so you can't really like cheat it or anything like that. You got to do
It's
it for
not like
real.
one of those, oh, just download the patched Game Boy Color version or the
Oh, I
original
see what you
Game Boy
mean. Yeah,
version. It's all on one ROM cart.
yeah, exactly.
And how long does it usually take you to finish do one of these retro projects?
They kind of vary. I think from below the original version took a few months to make, but and then Witch and Whiz was probably close to a year end to end, and then the current project I'm working on is probably going to be about a year, I think, by the time it's finished. But a lot. I find you can get through like a vast majority of it quite quickly. It's like all the details, getting the box art, QA, like beta testing, all that stuff that kind of drags it out. I think like for a simple NES game, like a lot of people participate in the NES development coding competition every year, and those usually come together in a matter of weeks to a month, kind of thing. They're smaller projects usually, but they're still pretty legit.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that moves us to your current project, which is Super Sunny World, I believe.
Yep.
Right. So, unfortunately, we don't have any actual footage of this because I think that's limited to your Twitter feed you mentioned.
Yeah, I don't have like a website for it or anything. Yeah, sorry. I could send something, but it's probably too late now, I guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah.
So I suppose for what is Super Sunny World aiming to be?
So yeah, Super Sunny World is essentially an homage to Super Mario Brothers 1. It's a 2D platformer, very like classic Mario gameplay, breaking bricks, stomping shelled enemies, kicking shells, power ups, warp zones, all that kind of stuff. But in a much more kind of modern pixel art direction, with more modern feeling gameplay. I kind of think of it as if Nintendo made a Super Mario Brothers 2 that was like a legit sequel to Super Mario Brothers 1. So not Lost Levels, not like Doki Doki Panic, but like a kind of a halfway point between Super Mario Brothers 1 and Super Mario Brothers 3. So it kind of sits somewhere in there. It was originally meant to be like very, very small in scope. I was hoping to finish it in a month. But it went really well during that month, and I didn't really kind of want to just push it out. I wanted to make sure it kind of got time to breathe and turned into something that reached its full potential. So, yeah, I've kind of been working on that since I think March this year, so probably 8 months or so. And at this point, I got most of the core gameplay done. I think last night I finished like the third world of 8. So it's coming along well, yeah, and it's super fun to play. I find myself kind of sitting playing it all the time when I should be working on it, so it's a good sign usually. But yeah, it's basically a Super Mario Brothers spiritual successor, I would call it. But original setting, original characters, all that stuff.
Of course. And is this just a NES game, or are you looking to also bring this to the Game Boy family as well?
Right now, it's just for the NES. I've been thinking about like what it would look like as a Game Boy game. I've also been thinking about maybe giving Super Nintendo a shot as well, and maybe a port of this to Super Nintendo would make sense. I don't know what I would call it though, because I already got Super in the name and World, so I'd have to have to come up with something.
Super.
Yeah, the most super world, or yeah. So yeah, but anyway, I do think about it actually. I think a Game Boy version would be fun to kind of think about, like a Super Mario Land kind of equivalent of this game. Thinking about that, but yeah, right now I'm 100% focused on the NES version, which is taking up a lot of my time.
Okay, and when do you think that will be available?
I'm not. Yeah, I'm hoping like I mapped it out and it was kind of dire, so I don't want to make any like I just guessed at how long each level would take me to complete, and it ended up being a very long time. But I'm hoping for like early next year to be in beta. I usually do most of my games on my Discord. I start up a private beta and kind of grind through bugs as much as possible and get feedback and stuff like that. So once I reach that point, it's usually a couple months of that, and like getting the box art and trailer and all that stuff together. So yeah, probably realistically, it's more like summer next year, but the game will likely be done before that. It'll just be a matter of kind of figuring out the publishing side of it.
Mm-hmm. All right, then. So I think I've run through my questions. Anything else from you guys?
I think I'm good.
Okay. All right. So, Matt, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule and being with us here today to talk about your home games, homebrew games. It was interesting hearing about tales of the modern day NES development, and Game Boy development for that matter. Like, I look forward to seeing what comes of Super Sunny World, and I'm sure my colleagues do as well. So, anyway, so the games are Witch and Whiz and From Below. They are available for download at witchandwiz.com and frombelow.com. Or from
That's
below
right, From Below
game.com.
Game.
Yeah. So, in terms of getting a real hardware version of that, I think the print runs have run out at this point in time. Any plans to do another run of From Below or Witch and Whiz?
No concrete plans at the moment, but for sure, like eventually, I think I'll do it. From Below, I just finished a run of it back in October, so for both the NES and Game Boy. So likely that one won't be for quite a while. Witch and Whiz hasn't been on sale for about 2 years now. And the exclusivity contract I had with Limited Run is up now, so I can technically sell it whenever I want, but I'm no plans to right now because there's a lot of work that goes into it. So I want to make it kind of worth the effort. So no plans at the moment, but it's definitely not like gone forever or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, so Petty, play us to the next segment. All right. Welcome to the topic of discussion. Right. So, Grand Theft Auto 6.
Yeah. If anybody didn't think we were talking about this, can I live in your rock too?
Oh boy.
It certainly garnered a lot of talk in the 3 days it's been out. Like, granted, it wasn't supposed to be released on Monday nights, but As I understand it, I was out food shopping when the trailer got leaked / dropped.
Yeah, the firestorm happened.
Yeah, it's like someone got a hands on the trailer and leaked it out. And Rockstar just said "fuck it" and put the real thing out without the watermark. And
Meanwhile, as the Rockstar Hit Squad is out looking,
I mean,
for
that's
another
better than
killer.
that's better than spending months trying to, or any amount of time really, trying to chase down and stamp out other sources and like
Mm-hmm.
DMCA them and shit.
well, I mean, it was too late to do anything about it. You know,
Yeah, but I know some companies that wouldn't stop.
Indeed.
right. And not surprisingly, Grand Theft Auto 6's first trailer has been a smash hit in terms of the ratings. You know, just a cursory glance from YouTube's metrics. The Rockstar Games version has garnered 114 million views, which I don't think is like the all-time record for a trailer in 24 hours. But I'll be honest, I'm not really checking for that kind of thing. Like, you know, the Grand Theft Auto 6 trailer is very popular.
Well, and I think if you would have combined it with that and the leak, they probably would have hit the all-time number.
Well, it's not just that. It's keep in mind the major gaming outlets have their own version. Because, like, you know, the GameSpot trailer has 18 million views.
Right.
And the IGN trailer here, or no, just 99 details from this GTA 6 trailer has 1.6 million views. You know, it's like there's a reaction video here that has 62,000. You know, it's not surprisingly, it has a lot of views.
Yeah.
And I guess to stack that up against the I got the Grand Theft Auto 5 trailer, which has 102 million views. That's lifetime.
Yeah.
So basically, the hype is real. Like, this thing got mainstream articles in like CNBC and publications and news sites, you know, well beyond the usual IGNs and GameSpots. Because, you know, surprise, surprise, Grand Theft Auto is still one of the biggest video game franchises to ever exist.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and now with even more Florida man. I mean, wait, what?
well, no, you're not wrong. Like, but I'd say definitely more, like, everything about that Grand Theft Auto 6 trailer is definitely the modern conception of Florida.
Oh God, yes.
You know, because you got to remember, it's been a while since we've been to Vice City.
Oh
Like,
God, yes.
We haven't seen Vice City since, well,
Vice
episodes
City?
from Vice City.
Yeah.
No.
Oh yeah.
Like,
There was it 4 that had we were at Vice City, or
no. Four was the return to Liberty City. 6 was back to San Andreas, and so just on that logical kind of progression, unless we went to either somewhere new or Rockstar, you know, throwing a complete left turn and going to London again. Grand Theft Auto did go to London in the mission pack or the first Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
You know, but, you know, ultimate point is it was time to go back to Vice City. And indeed, they've gone back to Vice City. And And yeah, it's like it's a very Rockstar Games trailer. You know, I'll be honest. I just wanted to make JoJo's references throughout the entire thing because, yeah, I was reminded of Stone Ocean quite a bit because not only do you have Florida Man there, you've got Florida Girl and Prison.
Indeed.
It's just instead of I think Stone Ocean is supposed to be like the Jacksonville area, or somewhere like northern East Coast, that kind of area. And let's just say Miami is a different culture than North or even Central Florida. I'm like,
yeah.
But it has to be different from the original Vice City, because if you remember Grand Theft Auto Vice City, that was basically Miami Vice.
There's a very 80s lens to it.
Yeah. This is, once again, this is modern day Miami, as seen with all the Instagram filters.
Yeah.
I'm like, and questionable satire of things. Like, yeah, I'm not sure why Rockstar is going after antidepressants.
Yeah, I don't know on that one.
But, given modern day stupidity, and the Church of Scientology, maybe not the best thing to actually be cracking a joke about. Yeah.
So I was expecting a few more bath salts references, but that's just me.
Yeah. And, not surprisingly, apparently Grand Theft Auto 6 is drawing from real life Florida news stories, because of course they are.
I mean, I would be insulted if they didn't.
Yeah. And once again, I have to remind people that, those stories exist because of Florida open records law. It's not that, more weirdness happens in Florida. It's just, because everything's literally an open book, there's better kept records of it.
Or at least not to the extent that it seems like it is.
Yeah. I'm like, yeah. So, oh, I see we have people.
Yeah, we're about time to get ready for the next show, so.
I mean, they're a bit early.
Yeah.
So we still have, Fragments time. So, anyway, in regards to Grand Theft Auto 6, of course, the graphics looked very impressive. In that Rockstar, ultra detail way that they've been going for since, I think, Grand Theft Auto 5.
Either 5 or at worst Red Dead.
Something like that. Red Dead 2 also had it. And of course, I'm going to imagine that people are going to be complaining about the controls when this game comes out, because.
Well, I mean, this isn't the first thing you're going to be complaining about. You've heard they're not releasing on PC to start.
Yeah, right? I've heard, which is typical Rockstar fuckery at this point.
Yeah.
Like, I can't remember the last time like a Grand Theft Auto game launched on PC same time as the console version. It'll probably be along in like half a year to a year.
Right.
And I see some PC players grumble about that. But there's not much that can be done, especially since, Rockstar knows where their money is going to be generated, and it is on consoles. Like, in terms of like the actual content of what's going on in Grand Theft Auto 6, we only got the first trailer. So there's not that much to go on right now, but keep in mind this game is scheduled to come out in 2025. So there's a year plus of hype, and we're assuming that this game stays on track for 2025.
Yeah.
And doesn't get delayed right on schedule.
Right. So, I do wish there was more to say about the actual game right now, but, it looks like a modern day Rockstar game. That's, it looks like it's going to play like a modern day Rockstar game. And I know that's going to frustrate some people who just keep hoping that the PlayStation 2 era is coming back.
Not. It's dead. Get over it.
Yeah. Also, having played Grand Theft Auto San Andreas recently, it's aged. Like, I don't think you know how much that's aged. So, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's not going back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, back to the, like I said, that game felt rougher than I remember it. Anyway, so yeah, I think that'll about do it for Grand Theft Auto 6 at this point in time. We'll probably be visiting this again when a new trailer drops.
Yeah. Or maybe we'll be discussing Crunch again when they inevitably that information leaks again. I am well aware of what Rockstar's bullshit was with Red Dead Redemption 2.
It was not just Red Dead Redemption 2. They've had problems with that going all the way back to the Rockstar housewife thing.
Valid.
Yeah. Anyway, so that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments of Silicon. Coming up on the week ahead, as always, there is a new installment of Moonhawk Studios Presents happening in about, let's say, 20 to 40 minutes.
It's ready.
I'm giving usual setup times because we say 11 o'clock. We get started at 11:15 to 30. So
there's a reason I snuck in here early, and that is because I am shockingly ready for once.
Duly noted. So 20 minutes, let's say. Anyway, coming up for Fragments on Friday, December 8th, we'll be having Caitlin Marceau of Grim Talon on the program. We will also be doing Petty Fans Missing a Review due to his cold on Friday night for Colored Effects. And on the Sunday reviews this week, we'll be having reviews for You Will Die Here Tonight, What the Tuck, Island Song, and impressions for Swarm Grinder. So until next time, I shall wish you good gaming.